So last week I did share that I had revised the study guide, that there were some changes to both textbooks, a new version of the software as a service, groundbreaking work with two faculty from UC Berkeley who have been honored with all sorts of awards, and then the original textbook was released in the second version. I also found a better copy of 6 Lessons from Failed Healthcare. So instead of posting the PDF for a reference, I've recast this or reconfigured this resource so it pulls directly from the CIO website. This is, yeah, I don't want to accept notifications from CIO magazine. Did everybody see that pop up? Yeah, you shouldn't have to worry about that kind of stuff either, but I do want you to read this article because it talks about some of the pitfalls of software engineering scenarios. And this scenario runs on the same scale as the consolidated criminal record project between law enforcement agencies after the Department of Homeland Security was created in the aftermath of 9/11. So most of you are young enough where 9/11 was not something that played out when you were an adult, but you may recall some things when you were little about 9/11. Is that a true statement?
I was a baby at that time.
Right. Yeah, it was quite a while ago now, but it did change our world in quite a number of respects, especially when it came to technology and how technology is provisioned, the resources are provisioned. One significant reason for including this reference in our generic review of software engineering essentials and challenges is that IEEE standards are cited in the course of this article. So there's all sorts of rich content and additional references that explain how complex, how many moving parts, what kinds of challenges, right? And essentially everyone went into this thinking that agile models were the end all be all, and it was a bit premature, right? So I do want you to spend some time. You will see some assessment items, maybe not in the first version or first attempt, but by the time we finish the item analysis and your final attempt of the module assessment, there might be just some plain facts. This is a great quote right here. Sprints and iterations do not an agile project make, right? So this would be an explicit example of some of the very concepts that we're covering in this module, right? And so that's a great header to kind of focus on for future reference. If I were dropping heavy hints about things, right? Which I'm actually doing right now. So, good afternoon, Akeem. How are you?
Afternoon.
Okay, so I do want to call out some specifics. In our materials, there are some essentials that have changed, and that the industry updates itself every now and then. So there's a kind of a reboot that occurs with concepts or industry leaders, and this is certainly the case for our course materials. So that's why we put out a version 2. You may recall last week I sent email and said, this is a major revision, right? So instead of being 1B or C or D, I just said, oh, okay, this is significant enough where if you have a revision 1 of any sort, you want to toss it. You want to make sure that you're pulling from this. And in particular, when it comes to the organization of the content, that's where we want to be very specific. So did everyone get a chance also to watch the videos 1.0 through 1.3 from this link?
Yeah, I think I have one more to watch.
Okay, so remember that in the references folder, you have to know this material well, right? And so I'm going to be revising the items in the module assessment for origins, software engineering origins and essentials. So just as I revised the study guide in a big way, I'm basically gonna review and carefully scrutinize the previous assessment items that we have from that module and incorporate these new concepts, right? So you're responsible for knowing everything in the study guide, the updated revision, everything in this 6 lessons from failed healthcare site, everything from the textbook videos. And, you know, I did beam this an email, and I don't know if you had a chance to see it. You all lead very busy lives. But I was basically dialing up some new concepts in the topic area, and I ran across this. And this is a team sport, we said. And you may be familiar with Dilbert or not. But if you hadn't looked at it and clicked into it, I just thought extreme programming is a form of agile programming. It's often called pair programming. Okay, so here you see a supervisor saying the 2 of you will be a code writing team. Studies prove that 2 programmers on 1 computer is the most productive arrangement. So the boss is a business guy. He really doesn't know or care about, you know, one of the things you know about Dilbert is that the administration, the finance, and the human resources team are like evil minions, right? And the techies here, and this is Dilbert and his pal, they're often preyed upon by this stuff. So, you know, this manager gets a bright idea. It's like, oh, 2 programmers on 1 computer. That means we only have to maintain 1 system for the team now, right? So here you see his friend going, you know, sometimes I can whistle through both nostrils. I've saved a fortune in harmonicas. So yeah, I know it's kind of a stretch, but anyway, I just thought that was a little bit of fun, and maybe with some deep processing, that will stick, right? And then here's the next one. It's another reference to extreme programming, right? So once again, extreme programming, they typically pair up people. They try to find compatible partners. One drives and the other one observes. So it's like you have a co-pilot who's watching the screen for, you know, preemptively for error conditions, simple mistakes in syntax, and so on. We're going to try something called extreme programming. First, pick a partner. The 2 of you will work at 1 computer for 40 hours a week. And here you see the end result, right? So, of course, you may find other humorous references to software engineering. As I haven't checked TikTok. I'm sure there's some crazy stuff out there on TikTok. I just have mixed feelings about TikTok because I work in cybersecurity, and there are some concerns about TikTok with regard to cybersecurity, and we won't go into that now because this is a software engineering course. But in any case, any questions about this stuff? Now, I want you to appreciate the fact that I require you to know all of this material, and I actually put 2 comic strips in your references. So I'm trying to make this enjoyable for what it's worth, okay? Are there any questions you could think of based on the concepts we've shared at this point? Are there any questions that come to mind?
Not right now.
No question for me.
Okay. I do want to look at the study guide. So we go in here and then look at the new version of this study guide. And I'm not entirely sure. I may look at the module cover just to make sure it's been changed as well. We only wanted you to read sections 1.1 through 1.3 from the Fox and Patterson reference. So this is the free one, SAS. And so this is the PDF. If you click on that link, you're allowed to keep a copy of this, right? And so section 1.1 to 1.3 basically covers the two different models or two different. So in all of this is inside the first chapter. So we don't really get to the rest of this book until later. And there's a similar parallel that you'll find in the other textbook, is that we're kind of jumping ahead to look at the models. And then we'll go back to the process and review process. But in 1.1, you have a generic introduction and then the plan and document models and the agile models, okay? So the adaptive models. And so according to UC Berkeley subject matter experts, the software engineering method universe is divided in half, and that's what we've been presenting consistently. However, in your textbook, the other textbook, so Rod Stevens, the older version or the first version of Beginning Software Engineering, in its first edition had a different cover, and now it's got this two-tone green and black cover. And part one of the textbook is about a review of the software engineering process. So it's kind of a walkthrough of the things that you do in order to perform software engineering. And we have affirmed that regardless of what kind of model or method you're using, that there are 5 basic stages of activity. And so this is a more detailed breakout of those 5 stages in separate chapters. So when you get to requirements engineering, there are components of design and requirements gathering that are incorporated together in this textbook author's reference. And so I basically wanted to call out to you that just like the SAS reference, we're going to deep dive into the methods and process that you follow regardless of the model chosen later on. But I revised the study guide to move ahead to process models. So in part 2 of the second textbook, and this is something that I've called out in the study guide, and I think I made, I said, please read this carefully. So the more I thought about it, I really believe, there are going to be some curveballs if people don't take the time to walk through this. According to Stevens, another industry expert, well-recognized industry expert, plan and document models can be broken down into predictive and iterative models. So generically, you can refer to plan and document models as predictive models because there's a lot of planning and documentation, right? Generically. But your author, essentially, Stevens here, takes the trouble of taking plan and document models and providing a subcategory. He breaks out the plan and document models into two separate categories, one called predictive and the other called iterative. And if you look closely, what you will find is that the same models that are covered in the chapter 17 of predictive models, we talk about waterfall, sashimi, incremental waterfall, the V model, and then you look at iterative models. We get into spiral, unified process, clean room and cowboy coding. Those are things that are referenced in the SAS, in Armando and Davidson, right? So let's see here. Where are we? So when you look at Fox and Patterson, Armando Fox and David Patterson, when you're looking at the predictive models or plan and document models, it's that same cluster of methods. Just remember that in the other reference, that's section 1.2. So if you look at and I explain this right here, right? So this is an important part. You talk about how the breakout in the Stevens textbook is a little different. Stevens organizes into two smaller categories, predictive and iterative. But both of those groups of models are traditionally considered to be plan and documentation models, right? It's chapter 19 in Stevens that talks about the agile and agile derivatives, right? So 1.2 in the SAS textbook tracks with 17 and 18. Let me say that again. In the Fox and Patterson book, 1.2 tracks with 17 and 18, and the other author has, a slightly different view of things. But in Stevens, chapter 19 and 1.3 in the SAS textbook, Fox and Patterson is all about agile, okay? And so what I wanted to do was to basically walk into this, right? I want to use largely, when we talk about the model or method, I'd like to use SAS as the primary reference. And then when we talk about process for how those are used and what people do once they choose a model or a method, we'll draw from both. So are there any questions about what we've just shared here? So just so there's no confusion at all, when you walk into 1.2, you see waterfall, and you see this term software development lifecycle, or SDLC, right? So, and spiral. So spiral in the other textbook is in chapter 18. And this information is actually very helpful. So the rational unified process, that's part of plan and document. So there's a very efficient summarization of how these models share, they share specific components, but yeah, and this is spiral. So when you're working with Spiral, it's iterative, meaning it's cyclical, and Spiral has a lot of trade-offs, right? So you kind of walk through the next iteration, right? So you walk through, you fix problems, and then you improve from there, and you walk through and fix problems and improve from there. It's an oversimplification, but essentially, and then this is RUP. You need to be able to identify if you see a diagram like this, and I say, what type of SE method is this? Is it plan and document, or is it adaptive? And your answer is going to be what? It's a plan and document model, right? RUP. So essentially, this is want your primary focus for understanding what's going on here to be this reference. Now, one other aspect of our textbook that I want to talk about, in the previous version of the study guide, I said you have to be careful when you see the term RAD. So there are software development suites that are called rapid application development tool sets, right? So it's all about the IDE, and you'll see references in industry to RAD empowered IDE environments. They're talking about the development environment. They're not talking about the team method or the model that the team will follow in order to work together. There is a flavor of Agile. There's a variant of Agile known as James Martin RAD. And that is all about a software engineering method or model, how the team plays together. And our second textbook, the author in the second textbook, classifies all of the adaptive models as rapid application development methods, because they're adaptive and the users see results and they're involved up front and all along the way. So the users are in the mix and they see this application developing before their very eyes. So Stevens, as a subject matter expert, chooses to use the acronym RAD in the same manner that most everybody else uses the phrase adaptive. And that's with regard to the method or model of teamwork that software engineers use when they're collaborating to create an application. So that kind of makes the acronym RAD even more confusing. But how would you discern which is which? Well, it all has to do with context. So if you're dealing with an IDE, an integrated development environment, and it's all about coding tools, that has nothing to do with a software engineering method or model of teamwork, right? If they're talking about James Martin RAD, that's a flavor of Agile. So the original was not James Martin. The other problem with this second edition, and I'm gonna share some choice words with Stevens. Seriously, I'm going to email him as a professor and say, you know, you're confusing. If you're not careful, you're going to confuse people more than you're going to clarify. So the idea that adaptive happens faster and you get more velocity and you get development quicker, generically, that is a consensus among people. It's like if you want to work with prototypes, if you want to be able to prototype solutions, especially large, many moving parts kinds of, enterprise-wide solutions, then you're more interested in adaptive methods. And Silicon Valley in particular, a lot of the titans of industry are adopting adaptive methods. So there's no question that this is the blueprint for the future. But ultimately, it's Agile and the Agile Manifesto that spurred all of this. And what's unfortunate is that based on the sequence presented, you might think that James Martin Rad was actually, it predates, or it was, prior to Agile. And so essentially, you'll see the same iteration of those 5 phases or stages. They're just different. I told you last week that they're called something different, right? So instead of requirements engineering, in James Martin Rad, it's called requirements planning. So there are all of these different variations, pretty much the same concept though. I did want to call this out. And so there are some methods here in the adaptive cluster, as far as adaptive types, that are introduced. This is extreme programming, by the way. Whenever you see XP, that's extreme programming, right? So, but there's a good number of additional methods that are investigated in this chapter, and that's one reason why we're still using this textbook, even though it's a little different than you might find elsewhere. I hope you recall last week I said a lot of work environments sort of blend models or methods depending on the need and the customer and the project. So there, if you start asking, if you're interviewing with prospective workplace environments and you say, hey, what model do you like to use here? If they cater to government, they would likely say SDLC because of the documentation requirements for government and regulations. Or they might talk about another document and planning model. They might say, oh, we use RUP because we have money and we can buy the IBM product, right? Or they may have a favorite, like, well, we do extreme programming all the time, or we do Scrum all the time. But I'm finding in my conversations with coding solution providers on this island, on St. Thomas, on the mainland, I have conversations with people all the time. While I'm traveling, during breaks, I kind of mix with an interesting crowd. They all do what makes the most sense for a given project, and they're not afraid to change, which is why it's good to know something about each one of them, okay? Are there any questions about what we've walked through in terms of the new distinctions for version 2 of our second reference and what you find in the new version of our open source reference? Now, in module 2 and in module 3, we are going to take a deep dive into each of those method categories. So we're going to learn more about each of them. I just want you to know, I want you to be able to recognize the names and be able to distinguish between. So when we say adaptive, I may tell you there's a method called Scrum, and I may ask, what type of software engineering method or model would the team organize their activities? Is it a plan and document model, or is it an adaptive model? And you should be able to tell me it's an adaptive model, even if a specific method is not listed in the Fox and Patterson open source textbook. If it's listed here, this is all adaptive, right? Kanban, feature-driven development, disciplined agile delivery, and so on. There is another element of interest. So in the videos, it talks about the essentials of the Agile Manifesto. So, this is an artist rendition of what happened at the ski lodge. when the programmers all revolted and said, hey, we're tired of working this old traditional method, you know, and we're always answering to one person and the users are never around and then they're disappointed afterwards. And this is just a awkward way to work, especially when there's a lot of moving parts. We need the users involved up front in the beginning, all the way through. See, and this is kind of a tipping point or an awakening that occurred. And it is very important for you. I don't expect you to know the names. I don't expect you to know the names of the founders, you know, the ones that wrote this. But this part right here, this part I do expect you to know. So in terms of general concepts, when somebody talks about the agile revolution and how creating integrated solutions in large companies and organizations, how that all changed, how the engineering process evolved. This is like before fire and after fire when you're looking at anthropological milestones. Everybody knows what anthropology is, right? Study of ancient man. And so when subject matter experts look at ancient man, there's a tipping point when they developed fire, when ancient man developed the wheel and simple tools, right? So you understand what I'm saying. Individuals and interactions over processes and tools, right? Working software over comprehensive documentation. What's most important is getting it to work. It doesn't have to be pretty, but trials and prototypes are huge. And getting the users to say, yeah, that's good. No, that's better. Like the optometrist visit. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation, right? So the customer is part of the team. And you don't want to snipe over contract terms. That leads to lawsuits, right? Well, you didn't include this feature the way we want to, so we're not paying the last part of your contract, right? That's nothing you worry about in Agile. It's a process. It's not about the destination and a final product to be delivered. It's about an evolving, always improving, moving target kind of thing. Responding to change over following a plan. If you have a plan and a roadmap, you have a final destination. If you have a process and the goal is to get something of value to your customer and to keep working with them so that they don't get tired of you, they'll keep paying you and you'll have a consistent revenue stream, right? So this is one of the keys to Agile that solved a huge problem. There were massive projects, they were too expensive, and it took too long. So the customers started to get very gun shy, and there was a time where software developers could have been out of work. I'm just going to say that plainly. There was a time where it was a little precarious, where, you know, software developers, people weren't happy with them and they got tired of it. And they're like, hey, the old ways are better. You know, there has to be something better. And there wasn't a lot of repeat business. There wasn't a lot of collaborative relationships that involved mutual benefit over a long period of time. There were some things about early planning and development that almost proved disastrous, kind of like the Titanic. When you have disasters and you have too many Titanics, what happens to the ocean liner industry? How many cruises, if the Titanic happened every third or fourth time a cruise ship left, how many cruise ships do you think would be on the docks right now? Just saying. Okay. Now, I'm going to pause the share. We're going to take a short break. I want to check remote access on our platform to see if we have the systems up and running. Are there Any questions? Can you think of any questions that would be worth mention given the information I just shared to you? Does this look like an IBM environment to you? All right, given a choice, which environment do you think you would prefer to work in? An environment where your coworkers are in a scenario like this, or like this? Let's see if we can find a traditional view of a programming team. Well, of course, this has all been modern. Well, all right, so yeah, people wearing shirts and ties, very formal environment. A lot of very big mistakes, very costly mistakes, right? A lot of constraints, a lot of frustration. And you look at how developing large applications has evolved. This isn't really giving me the kind of imagery I was thinking of, but still, yeah, this is probably a good example. So IBM tends to be pretty traditional, and you know, which one's very business oriented and proper and tightly organized, right? So you kind of get a feel for the old school versus new school environments. And coders got tired of this, and that's what led to this. And for what it's worth, I don't think we always get an accurate portrayal of how big a deal this was, but the fact that we still have a progressive and healthy solution development industry is largely due to new adaptive methods of teamwork and agile. So for what it's worth, you can say it was a train wreck when it got to the healthcare situation. Both types of models are really important. That's the takeaway from Blackboard when you read this. So before you conclude, oh yeah, this is really the wave of the future. No, there are still cases where government or healthcare or law enforcement or there's requirements by law. There's a different way to work the process, and SDLC is still like the reigning champion of that type of software engineering model. Planning and documentation, I'd say the one that you see the most common in the workplace is SDLC. So software development lifecycle is a variant of the planning and document or predictive. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing. Let's take a short break, and then we'll be back on screen. Let's rejoin at 3:30. One thing that I do want to stress before we stop recording, and I'd like to go ahead and share the screen again. There is mention of this in more than one study guide along the way. And in case we don't see it here, I want to search for a term. It's called BDUF. Has anybody ever seen a reference to that yet?
BDUF?
Yes, BDUF.
I'm not too sure. I don't think so.
Yeah, not in this version. of the study guide and not in the introduction to software engineering. But when we do a deep dive in legacy models or planning and document models, one thing that comes up, and you'll see this in the UC Berkeley resources, the open source textbook, and the videos. They talk about BDUF, Big Design Upfront. That acronym is another way of referring to planning and document models. So planning and document models are kind of notorious for big design upfront, right? Lots of documentation, lots of planning upfront. That's called big design upfront. And it is that reference that you see, that reference that you see when you're talking about the Agile Manifesto, they'll use this acronym quite a bit. So BDUF or BDUF methodologies, they're talking about plan and document models like waterfall and spiral. Very expensive, very long-term, very costly, and yeah, have sort of an infamous reputation. So I just thought we would call that out. And I may include like an addendum for the study guide with a couple of acronyms and some definitions like BDUF. If I don't, we've covered it in class and it's part of this reference and the reading assignment. So it's one of those things that we expect you to know about, right? So any reference to BDUF that's old school planning and documentation model. Any questions about that before we stop? In our study guide, we did take the time to talk about commercial off the shelf and challenges with documentation and how object-oriented programming can be a challenge if people get the wrong idea about what software engineering models are relative to OOP, right? Object-oriented programming. They're related, but not the same thing. This last one, implement and access a suitable SE development platform using UVI virtual resources. What I wanted to do was to pause the recording because I don't want your server names out in YouTube, but what I wanted to do was to go ahead and close out the recording portion of this class and then continue to share the screen with you. Temporarily, what we'll use is a platform we had in operation this last season until we get the new platform in play. We want to run trials on this to make sure it's stable before spring break. So that's one thing we want to do is make sure that the Active Directory domain environment and a few other things are solid before we expose students or afflict students with that. So that's our last objective for our Module 1 study guide, and that's something we're going to do live right now. So